All right, everybody, welcome back for another deep dive. This time we're looking into something pretty intense, a forensic report on a car fire in Whitefield, India back in 2018.
Yeah, this one is definitely a tough one to read.
Tragic, really.
Yeah.
A mother and her young son lost their lives.
And what makes it even more disturbing is that the investigator concludes it was no accident.
So we've got a real mystery on our hands.
It is like a puzzle, but instead of, normal puzzle pieces, we're dealing with burn patterns and melted metal and yeah, it's a lot to unpack.
And we're going to unpack all of it right here.
Absolutely.
So this report is full of photos and analysis.
Yeah, a lot of detailed stuff.
But if you were the investigator, where would you even begin with something like this? I mean, it's a car fire. How complicated could it be, right?
Well, you might think that, but the scene itself is the first big clue. Like, the investigator noted what they called uncommon white flames.
White flames.
Yeah, really turbulent, almost like they were anchored to a burner. Not your typical orange car fire flames. Yeah, and then you see the photo of the front left tire,
Right.
practically untouched.
Untouched.
I mean, while the rest of the car was totally engulfed.
That doesn't make sense.
Yeah, it's super strange. And then you get into the more technical stuff, like what they call unwarranted spacing around the doors.
Unwarranted spacing. What does that even mean?
Basically, it means the doors were pushed outwards with a force that just doesn't happen in a normal car fire.
Like an explosion.
Kind of, yeah. Almost like there was some kind of internal pressure buildup.
Okay, so right off the bat, we've got some weird clues here.
Yeah, a lot of things that don't quite add up.
So what does the investigator do next?
Well, they start by trying to rule out the usual suspects, things like an electrical short circuit.
Makes sense.
So they use this technique called arc mapping to analyze the electrical system.
Arc mapping, huh?
Basically, they're looking for any signs of a short circuit that could have sparked the fire.
Like a burn mark on a wire or something.
Exactly.
And did they find anything?
Nope, nothing. The electrical system was completely ruled out.
Okay, so not an electrical fire.
And on top of all of that, the fuel tank was perfectly intact.
So we can rule out a fuel leak or something like that.
Yep, definitely not your typical car fire scenario.
Okay, so what else did they look at?
Well, they were really thorough. They measured everything, the door gaps, the way the roof had sagged, all those tiny details.
And what did that tell them?
It pointed to an incredibly intense heat source, way hotter than you'd expect in a normal car fire.
Wow, okay.
Yeah, and then there's that whole thing about the power window motor.
Oh yeah, they actually did a DIY heat test using another car, right?
Exactly. They wanted to see if a malfunctioning motor could have generated enough heat to start the fire.
Clever.
But even after running the motor for a long time, it didn't get nearly hot enough to ignite anything.
So we can rule that out too.
Yep. No electrical issues, no fuel tank problems. It's getting harder and harder to imagine this was an accident.
Yeah, the investigators really ruling things out one by one. But it's also getting more and more unsettling, isn't it?
Absolutely. And then we get to the most disturbing part, the human element.
Right, the investigator describes a big difference between the mother and son's remains.
Yeah, that part of the report was hard to read.
I can imagine. Even the photos were, well, difficult.
To say the least.
The son's body, while badly burned, was at least recognizable.
Right.
But the mother,
Yeah, her remains were almost entirely consumed by the fire, even her skull.
the investigator says it's like she was exposed to a level of heat that just isn't possible in a normal car fire.
And they even did an experiment with animal flesh to compare, and the car's fuel alone couldn't have produced that kind of damage.
It's almost as if there was something else fueling that fire, something much more intense.
That's what the investigator seems to be suggesting.
And it's not just speculation. They actually cite a horrific bus fire as a comparison.
Yeah, even though the bus had way more fuel, the bodies were still identifiable.
That's a stark contrast.
It really highlights how intense the heat was in this car fire.
Okay, so we've got all these strange clues, all pointing away from a normal car fire.
Right, it's pretty clear that something isn't adding up.
So what does the investigator ultimately conclude? What's their verdict?
After ruling out every possible internal cause, from mechanical issues to electrical malfunctions, they came to a pretty chilling conclusion.
Light on me.
They determined that the fire was external and intentionally set. Basically, this was arson.
Wow. I mean, we had a feeling this wasn't going to be a simple explanation, but to have it confirmed like that,
It's a lot to take in.
yeah, definitely heavier than I expected. But it also raises a ton of new questions, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Like, if someone set this fire, who was it? And how did they do it? What could possibly create that much heat so quickly?
Right, the investigator says it was arson, but they don't tell us exactly what caused the fire.
It's like solving one part of the puzzle only to uncover a whole new layer of mystery.
Yeah, and that's what makes this case so fascinating. We've got a definitive answer, but it only leads to more question.
And that's what we'll be digging into next.
All right, everyone, buckle up. Things are about to get really interesting.
It's time to put on our detective hats and try to figure out how this fire was started and who might be responsible.
So we're left with this huge question mark hanging over the case.
Right, we know it wasn't an accident and the fire started externally, but the report doesn't tell us what actually caused it.
That's where we need to put on our detective hats. If you were leading this investigation, what would you look for next?
Well, the report mentions that the investigator couldn't get a straight answer about whether the fire sprinklers in the parking garage were operational.
That seems like a pretty important detail to overlook. If they were working, why didn't they put out the fire? And if they weren't, why not?
Exactly. That raises a whole other set of questions about safety protocols and whether there were any systemic failures that contributed to this tragedy.
It's a good reminder that sometimes these investigations uncover issues that go beyond the immediate crime scene.
Absolutely. And it highlights the importance of thinking about the bigger picture and how we can prevent similar tragedies from happening in the future.
So back to the car fire itself. The investigator mentions finding the ignition key in the debris.
Yes. And this is where those seemingly insignificant details can become crucial clues.
They determined it was in the auxiliary position. What does that even mean in a burnt-out car?
Think of it like this. The auxiliary position allows you to power certain electrical components like the radio or windows without starting the engine.
So the driver wasn't trying to start the car when the fire broke out.
Right. We can rule out anything related to the engine igniting or an electrical fault during startup.
It's like each piece of the puzzle shifts our perspective a little bit further away from the idea of an accident.
Exactly. And it raises new questions. Was the driver completely unaware of the impending danger, or were they specifically targeted while using the car's accessories?
It's chilling to think about someone being trapped in that situation.
And this is where the human element of the investigation becomes really important.
The report doesn't delve too deeply into the victims' backgrounds or potential motives.
That's true. But it's something investigators would need to explore in a follow-up investigation.
It makes you wonder if there was anything in their lives that could help explain why someone would target them.
Uncovering a motive is often a key part of solving any crime. It can help connect the dots and lead investigators to potential suspects.
So let's go back to the physical evidence for a moment. The investigator went to great lengths to document everything, didn't they?
Absolutely. They meticulously mapped out the burn patterns under the car, noted the condition of the wiring, and even analyzed the soot patterns on the fuel tank.
I was struck by how they explained their reasoning for every observation. For example, they pointed out that the fuel lines were unburned.
That's a crucial detail. It indicates that the heat source wasn't coming from the fuel system itself. The fire was concentrated in a specific area.
It's like they're taking us step by step through their process of elimination.
And that's what makes this report so compelling. We can see how they ruled out every possible internal cause for the fire.
They examined the engine, the electrical system, everything. And they found absolutely nothing that could have sparked such an intense blaze.
It's through this systematic elimination of possibilities that they arrive at their conclusion.
The fire had to be external and intentionally set.
And they're very clear that this conclusion isn't based on speculation or guesswork. It's based on the evidence.
So we have a solid answer to the was it arson question? But the how still remains a mystery.
And that's what we'll unpack next. The report doesn't give us all the answers, but it gives us plenty to think about.
All right, so we know the fire was deliberately set, but the report leaves us hanging on the exact method.
Yeah, it's like we've got this big piece of the puzzle solved, but there's still a missing chunk right in the middle.
Right, and without that piece, the whole picture feels incomplete.
Yeah.
So let's put on our thinking caps here. What are some of the possibilities? What could someone use to create that kind of intense heat so quickly?
Well, the report does mention a diesel generator nearby with a large fuel tank.
A diesel generator. Could that have been a factor?
It's definitely something to consider, but wouldn't there be traces? Shouldn't the investigator have noticed signs of tampering or a connection to the car?
Yeah, you'd think so.
Yeah.
But what if the evidence was destroyed in the fire?
That's always a possibility. I mean, this was a very intense blaze.
True. So we have to consider both options. Something readily available at the scene or something brought in specifically for this.
Right, and that's where forensic science gets really interesting. They would be looking for any trace of accelerants or ignition devices.
It's like CSI, but with a burnt-out car.
Exactly. They'd be swabbing surfaces, analyzing debris, looking for any chemical signatures that could point to the source of the fire.
So if we imagine someone planning this, they would have needed access to some pretty powerful stuff, right? Not just your average lighter fluid.
No, definitely not. We're talking about accelerants that can generate extreme temperatures very quickly, things that could cause that level of damage in a short amount of time.
And they would have had to apply it in a way that created those specific burn patterns that the investigator described. It's not as simple as just throwing a lit match into the car.
You got it. This was a calculated act. Someone knew what they were doing.
It's unsettling to think about how much planning and premeditation must have gone into this.
Absolutely. And that brings us back to the question of motive. Why would someone go to such lengths?
Right, the investigator concluded that it was arson, but they couldn't pinpoint a suspect.
And that's often the most difficult part of these kinds of investigations.
So what would the next steps be? If you were tasked with continuing this investigation, where would you start?
Well, a thorough background check on the victims is crucial. We need to understand their relationships, their routines, any potential conflicts or threats they might have faced.
Like building a profile of their lives.
Exactly. Motive is a powerful driver in these types of cases. It can help narrow down the pool of potential suspects.
And would you go back to the scene? Try to find any evidence that might have been overlooked.
Absolutely. The report mentions a diesel generator nearby, but there could be other things that weren't initially considered relevant.
Like what? Give me an example.
Well, imagine someone using an accelerant that was readily available at the scene, something like gasoline or cleaning solvents. If they discarded the container nearby, it might have been missed in the initial chaos.
Or what if they used something that completely burned away, leaving no trace?
That's always a possibility, which is why it's so important to be thorough and consider all angles.
It's like trying to piece together a puzzle with some of the pieces missing.
Exactly. But even with those missing pieces, sometimes you can still see the bigger picture.
So we're left with a lot of unanswered questions, but it sounds like the investigation doesn't have to end here.
No, not at all. There are always avenues to explore, new technologies, new evidence that could come to light.
It's a reminder that the pursuit of truth and justice is ongoing. It doesn't always have a neat and tidy ending.
And that's what makes forensic science so fascinating. It's about constantly pushing the boundaries of what we know and how we can use that knowledge to solve complex mysteries.
Well, this deep dive has certainly given us a lot to think about. It's made me realize how much goes into an investigation like this.
Absolutely. It's not just about finding clues, it's about interpreting them, analyzing them, and using them to build a compelling narrative of what happened.
Well, a huge thank you to you for sharing your expertise with us. It's been a privilege to have you here.
My pleasure. It's always a treat to dive into a good mystery.
And to all of you listening out there, thanks for joining us on this journey. We hope you found it as thought-provoking as we did. Keep those minds curious and never stop exploring the world around you. We'll see you next time for another deep dive.